Hello and welcome viewers to In Conversation with Taha. Today in the studio I have Janice Kortkamp, who is an independent journalist who has spent thousands of hours and resources championing the little herd side of the Syrian story. She has worked towards raising awareness about how biased the media outlets are. In only half a decade, which is an incredibly short amount of time, she has established herself enough to have voiced her findings on international media and even been to Syria multiple times. Janice, as she puts it, an American housewife in Syria. Welcome to the show, Janice. Thank you very much for taking the time to come and see us.
Thank you so much, Taha. It's great to be here.
So, Janice, what is it that entices you to be a part of this world?
What a great question. You know, what entices me to be a part of this world is that the world has human beings in it.
Okay.
And fascinating human beings, fascinating places, and to be in connection with other people is why I'm here.
Right, I understand. So, Janice, being a housewife and then being an activist,
Yes.
how did all this come? You know, where did that lamp kindle from suddenly that you decided to become an activist, and that too an activist in Syria?
Yes, thank you for asking. Well, it's about the strangest thing that's ever happened in my life. You know, I have two sons and they're grown now, but and we live on a farm in Virginia, and it has been a wonderful life. And then in 2012, I started paying attention to the news about the Middle East because the Arab Spring was going on.
Okay.
Colonel Gaddafi had been tortured and killed, and there were just some things there that were red flags to me that I thought it all seemed a bit fishy.
Right.
And so at that time, I was kind of online researching because I've always studied history and archaeology, anthropology, those subjects.
Okay.
And I noticed that the president of Syria had given an interview.
Okay.
And so I decided to watch it just out of curiosity to see what the justification would be for what we were seeing in the news.
Right.
And up until that moment, I had believed all of these various narratives that have supported all of these wars. You know, I thought the U.S. was trying to help Iraq, and we were there to bring freedom and democracy, and even about Libya, it was confusing. And so when I started watching that interview, it shocked me that literally about 2 or 3 minutes into it, I felt like he had a very articulate and precise way of speaking that kind of grabbed my attention and made me curious. And at the same time, he said something like, you know, anybody could be president, but I'm Syrian, I was born in Syria, and I'll die in Syria. And that made me curious about Syria as a country. And so what was fascinating was researching not just the political and military aspect of things, but also Syria's history and culture and society. And I became obsessed overnight. I can't explain it. My poor husband and family have had to put up with me literally all day, every day for the last 5.5 years, researching and tracking the war there on an hourly basis, really. And I'm so thankful that they support me 1,000%.
Well, yeah, family support is the most important, I would say.
Yes, exactly. And so after about 4 years of that, and had learned quite a bit and had been in many conversations with Syrians via Skype, et cetera, both in and out of Syria. And I felt I knew enough about the country and culture and the conflict to that I had to go and prove to myself that what I had learned matched reality on the ground. And since that time, I've had the privilege of going about every 6 months, and I spend about a month there in the country traveling around, almost always on my own with a Syrian friend as translator, although many people speak English there.
Okay.
And then for some of those trips, most of those trips, I also bring in tour groups of people like myself who are curious and have researched it and want to see reality on the ground. So for about a week each time, I'm with a group. And it's been a life-changing experience, really.
So, you know, I like the fact that you researched and you've read about the history of Syria and the Middle East and things like that. And culturally, it was a very vibrant country.
Yes.
I mean, I've had the I don't know whether I'll call it the privilege or not, but I had the privilege of passing through Damascus in 2003.
Oh, excellent.
And at that point of time, I couldn't have realized, or I couldn't have fathomed the fact that this country is going to be from where it was in 2003 to where it is today. So, you know, I would like you to tell our audience about the culture, about the history of this country, how rich they were, what was it that they have lost actually?
Great, a great question. Well, you know, Syria, of course, is one of the ancient geopolitical entities of the world.
Yes.
And since there's been civilization, there's been Assyria.
Yes.
Mark Twain visited and said of Damascus that Damascus measures time not by days or months or years, but by empires.
Exactly.
She's seen rise and fall and crumble to ruin.
Yeah.
And so you have a country that is a pearl.
Mm-hmm.
It's a jewel. It's a beautiful place. And it sits on the crossroads of the world. And so since empires have been fighting, they've been fighting over Syria.
Right.
And this has created in the people there, I believe, this deep savvy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they have, the people there are brilliant. They're very highly educated. It was almost 100% literacy rate before the war. Many of them are well traveled. They studied abroad, etc.
Yeah.
And they have this just kind of brilliance about them. They're very smart and wise about many things. And the culture there is surprising. For most people in the West, they know nothing about Syria as a country. Of course, it's a secular government and constitution. But secular is almost not the most appropriate word, because really all religions were not just protected there, but respected.
Yes.
And a wonderful, beautiful, really coexistence, mutual affection and respect amongst people of all religions there. And people in the West also don't know that, for example, it's a 90% Muslim, approximately, about 74, the great majority Sunni, Alawites, Shiites, Druze, etc., many different groups.
Christians.
And Christians. And there are hundreds of churches there from all denominations, both of East and West families. Easter is a national holiday in Syria, and Christmas is perhaps the most popular holiday there. You know, it's all over. And so you had that kind of beautiful experience, but also women are empowered there. They have virtually equal rights in Syria. It's a woman vice president.
And they can dress the way they want.
They dress the way they want, and often...
They don't have to cover their hair.
Exactly. And, you know, and again, it's not just kind of protected by law, but typically you'll have a girl in jeans and a T-shirt walking arm in arm with her mom or someone who could be fully covered. And nobody bats an eye.
Exactly.
And women are scientists, doctors, lawyers, leaders in government, community leaders, artists, musicians, jet pilots, you know. And this is something that few people in America, Europe even have ever heard.
Right. So now that we've set the stage for our audience to understand what Syria was, right? Let's get into what Syria is. And how did we reach where we are in Syria today? So your research didn't deter you from going into Syria. It actually took you into Syria. To view it with your own two eyes. Well, you can tell our audience, what did you see there then?
What you see when you go to Syria is civilization versus barbarism. What is not happening in Syria is a civil war. It is not a popular organic uprising against a so-called brutal tyrant. What it is, and this is proven very easily through government documents and official statements and policies and programs, that starting in the mid-2000s, the U.S. and its allies decided that they wanted to take control of Syria. And of course, we tried this in 1949, we were trying in the 80s, even earlier in the 2000s. And this has to do with geopolitical positioning. It has to do with gas and oil, particularly gas pipeline deals. It has to do with pandering to regional allies who have their own ambitions in the area. None of this Zero. This is what I really would love people to understand.
Yeah.
Has anything to do with freedom and democracy or anything good for the Syrian people. So what happened was, throughout the mid to late 2000s, the CIA and State Department and other intelligence organizations were in Syria, and they were literally fomenting sectarian hatred, violence, distrust through propaganda channels, and kind of created the first of many false narratives that the leader of Syria was going to be killing Sunnis.
Right.
You know, of course, his wife is Sunni, most of the army is Sunni, most
No,
of the
you say,
government.
of course, his wife is Sunni, but I'm pretty sure that our audience wouldn't know that. So I would like you to emphasize and, tell the audience what it means to be a Sunni and a Shia in Syria.
Okay. Well, again, before the war, most of my friends there say they didn't even know there were different designations and sects within Islam, you know. But the reality on the ground in Syria is that President Assad's wife is of a Sunni family.
Right.
Fabulous lady, truly a remarkable woman of intelligence and compassion.
Okay.
And most of the government officials are Sunni, and of course most of the army
Sunni.
are Sunni because it's a conscript army
Yep.
comprised of the population of Syria. So in the army, for example, you have Sunni, Alawite, Shiite, Christian, Druze. All the guys fight side by side in the army together against what has come up against them. And so this is the other side of it. So there was this manufactured kind of fomenting of revolution and wanting to overthrow the government among certain groups in Syria. And the groups that we chose were not good groups,
Right.
let alone it being just complete meddling and in a sovereign country.
We'll go to the groups, but you
Yeah.
know, the Western media is portrayed because the army was all Sunni, 100%. They kind of, in a way abandoned Assad and went away because of the Shia leader and the army being Sunni. So what you say is kind of contradicting that part altogether. Is he still being guarded by that Sunni army?
Well, you know, like I said, it represents the whole population of Syria. So it's a diverse army. Many Sunnis, they make up the bulk of the numbers, but also all of the other groups there.
Right.
And you talk about him being protected.
Yes.
Well, he just drove to Ghouta in his own car.
No, what I meant was, see, this is what the Western media says. And
Exactly.
I'm not in Syria, so what I see here on television every day,
I hear you.
that's what I talk about. And anybody who's just a common citizen like I am would be saying or understanding or comprehending the same thing when we look at the media today.
Sure. Well, the answer is that, you know, the Western media refers to it as the Assad army or Assad's forces.
Yes.
The Syrian people consider it their army.
Okay.
And they are very clear about that this is the army of Syria, Syrian sons and daughters, defending their families and their homeland from literally legions of terrorist groups.
Okay. So these terrorist groups, who are they then? I mean, are they the Western forces? Are they Iran? Are they Hamas? Are they Russia? Who are they?
Okay. Well, of course, it's quite complex because there have been hundreds of groups, and they change names throughout the course of time. But basically, these are groups that are proxy militias that are completely funded, armed, supported by foreign governments. So some groups are the CIA guys, some groups are the Pentagon guys, some groups are Qatar's guys, some are Saudis, some are sponsored by Turkey, some are by Israel.
Right.
So they all have different, what we call sugar daddies.
Okay.
But they all share the same ideology. And everywhere that they've so-called liberated in safe and secular Syria, Syria, by the way, was the 5th safest country in the world, according to Gallup polls before the war.
Interesting.
Including everywhere.
Okay.
So these groups are all funded and backed by foreign governments.
Right.
But they all share basically the same ideology. And they've all imposed a harsh interpretation of Sharia law wherever they've so-called liberated.
Okay.
And how this equates is, minorities are targeted for either execution or dislocation, and any Sunni that comes up against them.
So how come, they kidnap Yazidi women and brutality only happens on these Yazidi women? Not that I'm against any women in the world, but why do we in the Western media only know about this one particular sect of the community?
Yes, well, and of course the Yazidi, when you get into the Yazidi Kurd situation, there's a whole reasoning behind that, but you only hear about things that will support further military action by the West.
Right.
So while we focus on ISIS, because that's what we've heard in the news,
Yes.
in reality, al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda in Syria,
Yeah.
and the other terrorist groups have actually been more of a threat to the Syrian people.
Okay.
And they've all committed the same kind of atrocities that ISIS did.
I see. Okay.
So it's not that every single militant has eaten the heart out of a Syrian soldier like the Free Syrian Commander did.
Okay.
It's not that they've all beheaded children like al-Zenki did in Aleppo. But all of the groups, many of the people in them have committed horrific atrocities and videotaped themselves doing it, or bragging about it, and they're supporters.
Right.
So most of the people of Syria, and I'm talking 75–80% at least, we'll just call them all terrorists.
Okay. Okay. So, people like Jihadi John, who come from Britain, they are British Muslims, but at the end of the day, where are they finding the support from? Is it the Western forces which is giving them the support to reach Syria, or how does it work?
Well, ISIS was, of course, incubated in Camp Bucca in Iraq under the U.S.
Okay.
And General Michael Flynn admitted or said that after he had issued a report to President Obama in 2012, talking about how all of these groups were either Muslim Brotherhood or Wahhabi Salafi extremists, that the Obama administration made a willful decision to treat them all as assets in this overthrowing of the secular and popular President Assad.
Right.
So you have Jihadi John and things like that. A lot of the things about ISIS were kind of overly dramatic, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
They strike one as being kind of not false, because ISIS is a terrorist organization. They're terrible, but kind of staged and overly dramatized. It's critical to know that every journalist who went to Syria, who has been sold to ISIS, who's been executed, tortured, kidnapped, what have you, it's all been done by the so-called rebels.
Right.
It was the moderate rebels that sold Stephen Sotloff and Foley to ISIS, for example.
Okay.
So what I'm trying to say is ISIS was treated as an asset by the U.S. and our allies.
Right.
And we allowed it to grow. We did that on purpose. We did that specifically. There's definite evidence to prove that U.S. weaponry got to ISIS specifically.
Right.
For example, I was in Deir ez-Zor in October,
Okay.
and outside of Deir ez-Zor, near the airfield, is a place called the Al-Tharda Hill.
Okay.
And the Syrian Army had been in a static position there for a long time, flying Syrian flags, and they were fighting ISIS. And the U.S. coalition went and bombed them and killed about 100 Syrian soldiers.
And what was the reason behind it?
Well, the reason behind it was immediately ISIS captured that hill.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Very strategic position.
Right, right.
And this happens again and again and again.
Okay.
You mentioned the Yazidis. I could tell you stories about how in Iraq, the Yazidi militia would see how the U.S. would attack ISIS if it was making headway against the Yazidis.
Okay.
But they would attack the Yazidis if they made headway against ISIS.
Against the ISIS, I see. Understood.
So it's a game. It's all about justifying military invasion and occupation.
Right, right. But now that we see ISIS is depleted, it's now nearly finished. So is there another game coming up? Is there something else planned? Is there another army of soldiers that we're going to see coming up with another name or something like that?
Sure.
Is that the story behind it?
It's all part of it, and it's all been the plan all along,
Okay.
actually. The ultimate underlying plan was to, if we couldn't take full control of Syria,
Yes.
that we would split it into small sectarian-based states. And this is what you're seeing with the Kurds in the northeast. The U.S. and our allies couldn't care less about how many Kurds die. You saw that at Afrin.
Yes. Yeah.
But what they want is that just so happens to be the richest oil land in Syria.
Okay.
So what we've done basically is the U.S. did not liberate Raqqa. The U.S. stole Raqqa.
Okay.
And they want to justify the continued 100% illegal occupation of Syria. There's no legal basis for any operations there whatsoever, either internationally or domestically speaking.
Okay.
But they want to maintain a military presence there to control the oil and to continue to weaken the Syrian government and to be able to still create chaos.
And creating this chaotic situation, blame Russians and Iranians and everybody who's supporting Assad to gain more and more momentum in front of the Western world and audience.
Exactly.
Okay, understood.
Yeah.
I'm gonna talk about a presentation that you did as an American housewife in Syria, in Boston. Let's give a moment and share that with our audience right now. So when you were on the ground in Syria, how did your research and how did it affect your how did you understand everything that you were looking at in Syria at the moment?
It affects you in so many ways, both personally and intellectually, emotionally and intellectually, because when you go, you tend to absorb emotions from 7 years of war, and that can be a little difficult to process, and at the same time you've got terrorist mortars falling around your hotel, and so it's kind of crazy. But as far as research and understanding, I gained so much depth. And the Syrian people think they're afraid to talk about things, but they're very forthcoming. And so they'll go into great detail about all the background and the underlying stuff going on. It's fascinating. You were talking about how most people don't know such and such about it.
Yes.
Well, many people don't understand the Syrians have full access to the internet.
Yes.
They're watching BBC. They're seeing what's happening in the White House press briefings. They read Reuters, etc. They know it all.
Right.
And to be honest with you, they're horrified.
At what they see coming out of
the media reporting on Syria has been abysmal, and I would say in some cases criminal.
Okay.
In willful support of terrorist groups, like we're seeing about Ghouta and we saw about East Aleppo.
So what can we do to actually bring these people to justice? When you say criminal reporting, there is a certain person who's doing this criminal reporting.
Yes.
We need to somehow, because the humans living back there in Syria, they're not animals. Even animals don't deserve this treatment.
Exactly.
So what is it that we can do to help these Syrians?
Well, becoming aware. And it's very difficult because with the almost total media misrepresentation, it's very hard to find answers. And so there are independent activists and journalists like myself that we go and we report, and we've taken a lot of heat for that.
Okay.
But you have to kind of seek out answers. I have a website that has a lot of media resources about all of these things.
Yeah.
And so it's a process, but what's important to understand is after Iraq, after Libya in particular, that have been revealed to have been based purely on lies, those countries are completely destabilized, weakened. The people have suffered. We're talking, the latest report I heard was 2.4 million deaths attributed to the invasion and war in Iraq.
Yeah, but I mean, again, it's a conspiracy theory, and I've heard that people are saying the only way to control the population of the world is to cull human beings. Go to war.
Those people can go first.
No, but
Yeah.
this is the way.
Of course.
Sometimes you have to
Yeah.
do controls, put in ways and measures to do things, and
Yeah.
where do it the most, where people can't see with their own eyes. So on that note, was it something startling that you saw in Syria? I mean, was it some? Could you ever imagine something like that happening, not being physically over there?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So basically, I mean, the whole idea is that you went to Syria, you're physically there now.
Mm-hmm.
What is it that you saw there
Mm.
which you wouldn't have seen while you were in the US?
The magic.
Okay.
The magic of the people.
Mhm.
And this is actually to answer your other question, is the more exposure we get human to human.
Right.
For example, I have traveled throughout hospitality cultures before,
Okay.
and I've always had good experiences traveling.
Mhm.
The Syrian people are exponentially more gracious than anything I've
Okay.
encountered.
Mhm.
And this is during a war.
Right.
And so when you're in a group of Syrians, they have all lost loved ones.
Mhm.
Many have lost several. There was just a heartbreaking thing we learned yesterday that we could talk about if we could. But they've all suffered through the economic sanctions.
Mhm.
A lot of them left because of the economy, because of the sanctions, not because of the violence.
Mhm.
And so in spite of all the suffering,
Mhm.
still,
Mhm.
they want you to come to their house for dinner,
Right.
invite you to tea, go to their village.
Yeah.
They will shower you with the best food you've eaten and
Yeah.
telling stories and laughing. And there's so much love of joy and life there,
Mhm.
even still. And that is such an inspiration to me and all the other
Yeah.
people that I've taken in. We come out and say, we cannot ever stop sharing about this. We will
Right.
never stop.
Yeah.
Because it gets into your heart and soul, and you have to share it.
Right. Right. I mean, I can totally relate to that,
Mhm.
because I come from Kashmir, which has been on the boil for the last 28 years. And, sometimes people will ask me here in the Western world that, do you have to duck out to go out and buy groceries because there's a war going on? And I say to them exactly what you've just said, that, we are human beings. We live a very normal life there. Yes, there are bullets and bombs, but it doesn't mean that 24 hours we are being under bullets and bombs. So, we walk. We have restaurants which are full of people. We have to make reservation for a dinner. So yeah, life goes on as normal.
Exactly.
And the hospitality, there was this Indian major from the army. He has retired, and he came on the news one day, and he's like, "Why do Kashmiris have red cheeks when they're in a war?" And
Red sheets.
the whole of Kashmir was laughing, thinking, how can a learned man,
Yeah.
like an ex-army major, talk about a war zone and people having red cheeks in that war zone because there's not enough food for them to eat. So, I can totally relate
love
to what
that.
you just said.
Yes.
It's mind-boggling that, how people's perception can suddenly change. But
Yes.
so, that brings me to the question of asking you, what gave you the confidence of doing this? What gave you the inspiration to go into Syria and then, expose how the international media was talking about
Yes.
things and their narratives, and what brought the responsibility in you to take out all of this information and give it to people like me who don't know anything about Syria?
It's been a process. And one thing I notice is that thankfully you don't see the end when you start something. Because if somebody told me I'd be in Deir ez-Zor with ISIS around in Syria, I'd think you're crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But you build up confidence over time. And it's the combination of the confidence and the love of the people, and how everywhere I go in Syria, they say, you are most welcome in Syria.
Mm-hmm.
And they practically take me by the shoulders and say, please, please go tell the truth to people in the West.
Yeah.
And those experiences, I would dishonor all humanity in my friendships if I didn't continue and be courageous, because I think that this is a time when we have to be courageous and speak the truth and hope for the best.
Well, we do hope for the best for the Syrian people, and
Thank you.
I hope that sense prevails over all quarters, and they see the light of day, which they really want to, and not just be under bombs and bullets all the time. So let's look at the expert advice you gave during a segment in one American news network, where you spoke of the myth of Syrian rebels.
Great.
So during this, you referred to funding from US being problematic and potentially a large part of the issue. How did you come to this revelation? Did you speak to a specific group of locals in Syria or corroborated this claim?
Well, this is well documented, actually. And, you know, President Obama had a $500 million train and equip program for so-called rebels in Syria.
Okay.
Before the war, actually, the U.S., the CIA had spent $6 to $10 million training so-called journalist activists,
Okay.
even before the violence broke out.
Mm-hmm.
And then since then, you know, that $500 million is just kind of on the table.
Okay.
Funds. The CIA admitted that they had paid Syrian rebel fighters $400 a month
Okay.
to fight. Saudi paid similar amounts, Qatar as well.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, the problem with that is the Syrian soldier makes a tenth of that.
Okay.
So the so-called rebels were making 10 times the amount, and that was the major incentive for them to join this so-called revolution was money often.
Right.
Also drugs, women.
Mhm.
They took Syrian girls and women, you know,
Right.
sex trafficking.
Right.
And so this is well documented, but it got so crazy that, for example, in eastern Aleppo, we had CIA-backed militias
Okay.
literally combating Pentagon-backed militias.
Very interesting. Okay.
Insanity, you
Mhm.
know? And all of those groups in eastern Aleppo that you heard incessantly on the news,
Mhm.
oh, we're so concerned about the people in eastern Aleppo and the freedom fighters there.
Right.
They had all pledged to be under submission to Al-Qaeda, every
Okay.
single one. They were all shared the same ideology.
Okay.
They would shoot people, civilians who tried to leave their areas.
Okay.
They lied about how many civilians were in there. It was
Mhm.
just a fraction of what they said was
Right.
there. And the people that came out, for example, one woman, she was begging for food because they would hoard the food and medical supplies, actually.
Mhm.
And they shot her in her mouth for daring to beg them for
Wow.
food for her family.
Okay.
So this is nobody that anybody, any rational, civilized human being would want to have in their neighborhood, in their town. Same
Right.
thing with Eastern Ghouta and
Mhm.
Duma that we're
Mhm.
hearing about now. So all of these groups, like I said, have been funded in many different ways. France has supported some, UK has supported some. You know, it's just been kind of this devil's brew in
Okay.
Syria.
Okay. Okay.
Absolute
Mhm. Mhm. So
recklessness.
it's just a mix of nonsense which is happening there, and
Yes.
the Western
Murderous-
world is supporting that nonsense.
Yes, murderous nonsense.
Okay. Okay. So, how do you differentiate between what is genuine news and what is not genuine news, or the resource behind that news that you're receiving?
Sure. Well, there are a couple of flags that
Okay.
you can. If you hear it in the mainstream media, if you
Yeah.
flip it about 180 degrees, you're going to be much closer to reality.
Okay. Okay.
It's virtually that bad. I would say 95% of the reporting about Syria has been
Mhm.
totally misrepresentative.
Right. Right.
But also, if there are certain key words, for example, if they refer to the Syrian government as a regime,
Right. Okay.
or the Syrian Army as regime forces,
Okay.
that's a clear bias.
Mhm.
If, you know, for example, I remember President Assad would give an interview,
Yeah.
and every single outlet would say, in a rare interview, a
Mhm.
rare appearance,
Mhm.
a reporter in Lebanon counted it all up. He's given more interviews and appearances than all other Middle Eastern leaders combined.
Right. Right.
You know, so it's a sly tactic that
Okay.
is used to put your thinking in a certain mindset.
Okay.
If they call these militant groups freedom fighters or moderates, for example, Catholic Archbishop Jacques Hindo,
Mhm.
Syrian Catholic, he said the Western media keeps talking about these moderate rebels. They do not exist.
Mm-hmm.
They do not exist.
There's nothing like moderate rebels.
There is no such thing as a moderate rebel. It's the, you know, unicorn rainbow kitten of the Middle East. They don't
Right.
exist.
Right.
And so not one single person would want them
Mm-hmm.
in their country, let
Okay.
alone in the neighborhood next to them.
Right.
And yet, the Syrian government and army are demonized and villainized
Yeah.
for fighting them.
Right, right, right. So why do you think this bias in the media? Why is it prevailing in Syria? Why aren't we seeing more people like you who are fighting to tell the truth, to get the media space or the screen space to tell the story?
Yes, it's brutal. Like we said before, it's criminal because after Iraq again and after Libya, you'll notice that people like the New York Times
Yes.
editorial board said, oh, we're sorry.
Okay.
We cherry-picked stories. We made a big boo-boo.
Right.
We'll never do it again.
Right. Right.
Libya did it.
Yeah.
Syria did it.
Yeah.
So what a person who's logical has to understand is that it's no longer can be considered a mistake.
Okay.
This is deliberate yellow journalism,
Mm-hmm.
supporting and fomenting war, and then after all the death and destruction, they'll say, oh, I think maybe we made a mistake there.
Yeah.
You know, this is what you
That was
call...
a slight mistake. We dropped a bomb in the wrong place. We shouldn't have done
Exactly.
that. We
Yeah.
should have bombed the other place.
Yeah, so
Understood.
these aren't mistakes anymore, and it's time for people to wake up, and I say grow up
Okay.
and
Right.
realize they're not mistakes, but it's deliberate action.
So how do you think this can be changed now?
Thanks to people like you.
Okay. So to bring people like yourself and talk to them and make our audience aware about what
Yes.
is exactly happening on ground zero,
Yes.
rather than believing sources which are just a made-up story like a soap opera which they want to listen to.
Exactly, and because of the communications these days,
Mm-hmm.
there are fabulous journalists in Syria. So
Okay.
many Syrian journalists have lost their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Don't listen to me.
Right.
You know, you can talk to somebody there and get what they're saying, which is what I did on Facebook and how I started knowing about things.
Sure.
And independent media, I believe, is one of the few hopes we have.
Yeah. No, I mean, we'll definitely, surely give the screen time and the
Great.
and the airtime possible to people like you and
Great.
tell our audience the true story behind what's happening in Syria. But you know, there are difficult questions which need to be answered at the same time. So, in things like what I'm asking you today is something like, what is the biggest obstacle you have faced in bringing news like this to a channel like ours? What's stopped you, or what kind of people come in your way to bring in the true information?
Yes, well, I think the biggest thing has been that the media onslaught has been so effective that if anyone comes out and says, well, you know, the vast majority of Syrians actually support their army and president,
Okay.
you're immediately dismissed.
Mm-hmm.
You're called an Assadist, you're called a Putinist,
Right.
Russian troll.
Right.
You know, people have been programmed that there is no other side.
Right. There is only one side.
There is only one side,
Okay.
no matter how illogical. How can Saudi Arabia be helping bring freedom and democracy to Syria when Syria is light years ahead of Saudi Arabia
True.
and all of those things?
True.
And so you have journalists that won't ask the basic questions,
Right.
and they don't want to hear from somebody like me.
Mm-hmm.
But I think since it's been 7 years, since it's obvious that President Assad is not stepping down, and in fact has the support of his people,
Right.
that people are starting to question. There's some more cracks appearing in the wall.
I see. Okay. And what do you have to say to people who are, you know, branded as Syrian sympathizers, or who are then again have a hidden agenda in their journalism?
Yeah, well, you know, we're human beings, so we all have biases.
Right.
And what do I say to people like that? I would say that it's so important to listen to all sides of a story and to do so with humility and respect for other people
Yeah.
and to not label people, not put them in boxes,
Yeah.
and to assume and understand that every human being has their own baggage, their own agendas, what have you. Some agendas are from the top down, so to speak. That's a different story.
Yeah.
But listen
Mm-hmm.
and use your own mind.
Yeah.
Use your own common sense.
Right.
And we've kind of steered away from doing that. We're used to, we're being told by experts, all of whom are paid to push the war agenda.
Right.
Every single think tank, defense contractor, former generals, etc., they are all paid to support the military-industrial complex.
Right. Right. Like we hear the PR of radical Islam. The terms are being brought out so that people are scared, and the scaremongering, the nepotism can be brought out in a larger way.
Yeah. Could I make one other point?
Sure, please.
This is really important. People in the West do not understand that exponentially it's more Muslims suffering and dying from terrorists and extremists, and same fighting terrorists and extremists.
Yes.
If it weren't for the mostly Muslim army of Syria, the Christians would be dead.
I know, yes.
And these are basic truths that we just need to reiterate over and over again.
Yes.
Because we're either brothers in humanity.
Yeah. I mean, see, the two things that I can gather from the conversation I've had with you so far is there are nearly 2 billion Muslims in the world.
Yeah.
All 2 billion not terrorists.
Of course.
And those 2 billion are protecting this earth. Those 2 billion people are protecting other people on this earth. And they are coming up with inventions and innovations, and that's why the world is moving. Otherwise, a liability of 2 billion people can drown the earth in the water that we have.
Well, this is true. You know, the Muslim civilizations, these deep-rooted civilizations, especially in these rooted ones in Syria, etc., you know, the love of learning, the love of other human beings is so important. And there was another point I wanted to make, but I lost it, but I love what you said. And we're all in this together.
Yes, yes, yes. So let me ask you this question, that what is your proudest moment till now then?
Well, other than marrying a wonderful husband and having 2 amazing kids.
That's very good.
The most amazing, extraordinary thing was being in Deir ez-Zor.
Okay.
And witnessing, seeing those guys that were on the front lines. You know, some of those casualty rates were tremendous.
I see. Okay.
And being with the people who had been liberated from under ISIS rule. I'll never forget it.
I can imagine. I can imagine. As I said, I've been in a conflict zone, so I can imagine everything that you say. So what's your ultimate aim with the work that you're doing? What is it that you would like to achieve?
For people to wake up,
Wake
up, ask questions, stop supporting war, say no.
Okay.
If some government official is telling you some guy's a tyrant and has to get taken out, assume they're lying.
Okay. Okay.
Assume it's a lie, because it's been proven to be lies, 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 lies. And all they're trying to do is get us to sacrifice our sons and daughters
Right.
for yet another disastrous war that's going to kill millions of innocent people.
Right.
And actually create enemies for our sons and daughters to fight
And generations.
the next generation.
Yes.
So stop the madness. If I could just get people to think, that's all.
So you're trying to say something like this, that how does a brand new Toyota Hilux reach ISIS in Syria without anything happening in the background, right?
It's a miracle.
It's a miracle. It just happens. The car flies in. And then the weapons, where do they come from? Oh, not just the weapons, the ammunition, the bullets. You know, they fly in from somewhere.
Yes.
Someone is selling it to someone, and that's how ISIS has it, or any other terrorist organization has it. But it is actually the person who's the biggest terrorist who's selling those weapons to them.
Exactly.
So yeah, I would love to, you know, appeal to our audience to please think about these things rather than not just listen to the Western media and think it's a film going on there like War of Lords and everything just falls from thin air. Is there anything in your opinion that you would like to say could solve this matter peacefully?
Sure. Well, two things that we have to say is the Syrian army and the Syrian president never have used chemical weapons in Syria.
Okay.
Each and every time they were winning, momentum was gathering, and all of a sudden they decided to do something really stupid that would require more action by the U.S. and the Western allies militarily.
Right.
It is a juvenile, moronic, false allegation. I had to say that.
Right, right.
What can be done from this point forward is for foreign armies that are not invited by the Syrian government, so that's the U.S. and the coalition, Turkey and Israel, to get out of Syria.
Okay.
To recognize that Syria is a sovereign, independent country,
Right.
that they have the right to defend their country against terrorists,
Right.
and to let Syria and their allies finish defeating the terrorists that remain there.
Right.
Syria, I've been to Aleppo and homes that were liberated from these terrorists. The rebuilding level is amazing. It's astounding. They're productive, inventive, hardworking people. They will rebuild their country in no time.
I see.
And end the sanctions.
Right.
Sanctions are not about punishing a foreign government. They punish the people of the government,
Right.
of the country, so that hopefully they'll rise up in frustration against their government. And it's killing people.
Yeah. You know, on that note, I'm going to ask you another question. You know, a lot of people from Aleppo and Homs were invited into Germany. And all of a sudden we saw that these nurses, doctors, engineers who qualified, learned people. Now again, you know, this wasn't emphasized in the media, that people who migrated from Syria to Germany were doctors, engineers, nurses. And all of a sudden Germany welcomed them with open arms. Well, the reason is they're getting a workforce without spending a dime on them, and these are learned, experienced people who are doing a great job, were doing a great job in Syria, and now are doing a great job in Germany. So, you know, what do you have to say to this migration of skills from a country which has spent so much time and effort on some people?
Yes.
Which has already all of a sudden been drained out of the country?
That's a great question. You know, Syria before the war was spending 16 to 17% of GDP on education.
Okay.
And with a specific highlight in doctors and scientists, etc. This happened in Iraq too, with scientists, intellectuals, teachers. It's called the brain drain.
Yes.
And so the West creates these wars and then says to the intelligentsia, the intellectuals, oh, let's save you, we'll save you out of this war.
Yeah.
And that is the looting, goes along with the looting of archaeological treasures as well.
Yes. Yes.
So this is a destruction of civilization that I believe is deliberate.
Right.
And, you know, and of course, prior, in the 10 years under President Bashar, prior to the violence starting, 11 years, there were no refugees from Syria.
True. Yeah.
How many times do people question that? They were free to go. It was not an Iron Curtain country.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, so there's a mixed bag.
Yes.
Germany and everybody are going to get some of the greatest
minds,
citizens that they can possibly imagine.
Sure.
And they got a lot of people that support the terrorists and their ideology.
True.
It's going to create a lot of problems.
So, you know, I'm going to tell our audience today that I hope we will leave you here with some questions that you need to ask. Go out there, speak to people, and see how you can help the Syrian people in whether they are now stuck in Syria or wherever they are in the world. Every Syrian is not a terrorist. Every Muslim is not a terrorist. And on that note, I will thank you, Janice, for coming in to our studio and spending some time with us. And thank you for answering all our questions and enlightening our audience today. And to our audience, thank you very much once again. Keep watching Asia TV for more news and updates, and I will see you next week. Thank you very much. Yeah.
There was some answers that Janice was off camera,
Okay.
like when you talk about depopulation, and she said those people can go first. we should have the camera on Janice so she can say that line again. And there was the what you like about Syria, I think, the magic of the people. She was off camera then.
Okay.
So I need those because they're important.
Don't worry about it.